And one of the things our guest does very well is he looks at some of the things that are happening globally, that's happening here in the States, this move to a westless world, those things that aren't on my radar, you're not going to find them plainly in the text. I don't think they violate the text. They don't get outside the fly zone of the text at all, for the most part. And what I love about Doug, and the reason, even though that's not something we dabble in too much, is Doug's not just saying it from any type source, but he'll have in his hands the source from the World Economic Forum, from these places. He's getting it straight from the horse's mouth. That's when we had this interview. Okay. Again, passionate. I don't want to come off today. So, Shirley, take it away.
Yes, for nearly a decade, Doug Carter has stood at the intersection of culture, religion, and politics. He's taught 25 semesters of college, ethics, religion, and Bible courses, given numerous podcast interviews, and written perspective-shifting pieces on today's biggest world issues like climate change, censorship, education, the economy, and the effects of globalization. His works have been featured on Rush Limbaugh Show, WND, Western Journalism, Freedom Outpost, The American View, and Barbed Wire. Doug's podcast experiences and appearances have included PJNet, Mountain Climbers, us here at Stanford Ministries, and Armageddon News. Welcome, Doug, my good friend. Let's see if we can.
He's not wanting to come out of the green room.
Yeah, if we can get his video, he is wonderful.
Give us feedback if you hear it or don't. Well, Doug, I've been looking forward to this conversation for some time. Of course, you've been with us before. Just incredible, your research and what you bring to the table. You know, one of the things that I have just really focused on, as I've mentioned earlier in the program, is I feel like my approach is more of, okay, biblically, what do we have in the text? And it seems like we have more of the final picture, the picture at the end of the age, but we're not given a whole lot. I mean, not the amount of details we would love to have from now till then. And so, but we can go to the end and, have a trajectory of where we're going. And I think we also build guardrails of what it can't be. And so, and so I think that's been what I've wanted to do. But this year, as we started this new year, I just become overwhelmed that we need to talk more about what's going on in the West. That was, of course, before this invasion in the Ukraine. And of course, it's even brought more to the forefront. And so I reached out to you and said, hey, come back on and help us. And as we were preparing, I'm like, I don't even know what to ask, because I really don't know, other than just things seem wild. Things seem like a mess. And so I'm just asking you, as a watchman on the wall, who knows the word, but also dives into it's not conspiracy type things. You're diving into real documents that are out there, that are available, that are printed, of what's being thought of in leaders of this world. And it's some wild stuff. And we're seeing the impact of that. We need to know where this is coming from. So as a watchman on the wall, what are you seeing?
Oh, wow, Jake, that's a big topic. So what I'm seeing is we're moving from the Great Reset. Okay, so that started in 2020, and that is resetting the socioeconomic landscape for the world. And they want to make everything more equitable. They want to make jobs more plentiful, but at the same time, they want to make them sustainable. And what I mean by sustainable, or what they mean by sustainable, is they want to make sure that we are leaving enough resources for countless generations in the future. And what that means is we're going to have to cut back on our production and consumption. Now, they closely tie this in with climate change. And the idea is that our production and our consumption is causing carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere, which is causing the planet to heat up. Now, what's interesting about that is this whole great reset that we're in hinges on the idea science is telling us that if we don't limit our the heating of the earth to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Used to be 3, then they cut it back. Now it's 1.5 degrees. In just a matter of a few years, then we're going to experience catastrophic climate change, and it's going to decimate humanity and the environment. So the question is are they right?
Yeah.
And how do you verify that? And so what I like to do is I like to think of this in terms of philosophy. Okay, so I'm an ethics guy, and there's 3 ways that we can know things. You got deductive reasoning, which is being absolute 100% certain that you're right, and there's no way to know anything in the future is going to be 100% certain. So then you appeal, so then you appeal to inductive reasoning. Now, inductive reasoning is you're looking at evidence and you're predicting an outcome, or you're saying this could be right, but that's not science. Science is based on deductive observations. Now, inductive reasoning has its place, but there's an even better way of reasoning, and that's called abductive reasoning. Abductive reasoning is when you take all the evidence that you can get and you look at all of it and you make the best inference of all the evidence. You don't leave any evidence out if it's there. You don't ignore it. And here's what's going on with the Great Reset. And they are taking inductive reasoning using computer models that they generate, inputting data that they create or that they collect, inserting into algorithms they generate to spit out results. So
sounds rigged.
It sounds rigged, but let's take it another step. Are they looking at all the evidence? And I don't think they are, because there's a lot of evidence from the NIPCC, the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change, did a lot of research, and they came up with conclusions that did not match the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And to give you a parallel for comparison, you think about the medical research around COVID. You know, we're being forced into this one narrative, and everything that deviates from that narrative is deemed misinformation or disinformation. And, you know, people are getting canceled over that. You know, platforms are getting destroyed, and you're controlling access to information.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll take us back, because we recorded previously with you and we went through the Great Reset. And so for folks tuning in, you can find that link in the notes as well. But just kind of quickly tell us what the Great Reset is, but where's it coming from? You've mentioned they. Who's they? Okay,
so they would be the World Economic Forum. And I'll show you this book too, COVID-19, The Great Reset. With Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum. And that's a collection of academics, business people, and world leaders and activists. And they come together and they shape global policy. And this has been going on for a long time. You've got other groups connected with them. The Club of Rome, for instance, you know, I've got information going back into the 1960s, 68, actually. Well, in 1972, they came out with a book called The Limits to Growth. And The Limits to Growth is where they created these global models, computer models. And they said, well, if we don't change the way we're growing with our almost unlimited production and consumption, then we're going to run out of resources. So when you talk about the end of fossil fuels, this is where this comes from, is their research. And so that kind of kicked off, let's see, the Stockholm conference was an environmental conference. In fact, in June of this year, they're going to have their 50th anniversary. They're calling it Stockholm plus 50. And
I didn't realize this went back that far.
Yeah,
climate stuff. I mean, it seems new. I mean, it seems just more recent, the last couple of decades at least. So, or at the most. So it's wild.
Yeah. So all this is coming together, and they know that they got this one opportunity to shift us onto a path of sustainability, and they call it the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Now, what caught my attention about that was their goals are to make sure that the planet stays around for a couple of hundred more years. And one of the architects of the sustainability movement was Jorgen Randers, and he's one of the co-authors of The Limits to Growth I mentioned. He's been with the Club of Rome off and on for a number of years. And he said in 2012, in his opening remarks at Cambridge University at a sustainability conference, that in order for the world to be around for another couple hundred more years or so, we have to reverse the way mankind has thought most of its presence on Earth, the biblical way of thinking. And when you're talking about reversing the biblical way of thinking to sustain the planet, you're taking the antithesis of the role of Christ, because Christ, in Hebrews 1, 2, and 3, God is our creator, Christ is our sustainer. And so I'm asking the question, do they really think God created a world that he can't sustain?
Right.
And they completely leave God out of the equation. In fact, what they're building in this great narrative is a humanist world. Now, UNESCO, the United Nations, are very explicit about it. It's explicit in here as well. They want to create a humanist world. That's a world without God. And what it all boils down to, Jake, is it's another gospel. It's another plan to save the world. Yeah. And I think that opens up a doorway for us to have meaningful dialogue.
Yeah.
If they want to save the world and Christians say, look, we've already got a plan to save the world.
Right. Yes.
Jesus came up with that 2,000 years ago, but theirs is the exact opposite. So they've come up with this counterfeit, the antithesis of Christ's role. And you know what that means. You're setting up a stage where you want people to be of one mind and give their authority and the power to the beast.
Yeah.
And you know what comes next.
Yeah.
They're going to make war against the Lamb. And why would they make war against the Lamb? Probably so they can save the world. And they are very serious when they're talking about overpopulation. When they say that our production and consumption is a problem, it's causing us to kill our species. And one of the quickest ways to get our production and consumption down is to lower the population.
Which goes hand in hand. Just yesterday, you posted an image on Facebook that was quite alarming. Really just the population growth, and showed it's not growing exponentially as you would expect, which, I mean, this is going right back to the garden. The things, I mean, you've already mentioned,
exactly.
Basically when mankind was given dominion over the earth, that's being taken away through this. And then we're also seeing the be fruitful and multiply. I mean, the bare basics that we're called to do in obedience to God being reversed. So, I mean, the book you just held up, I mean, this just blows my mind, because I'm not, necessarily in this world, but the Great Reset, I mean, I've heard people talk about it. There's tons of videos out there and all those things, but it's not like some conspiracy. It's these, in lack of better terms, I know it's more than this, but basically the think tanks that are funneling, that's info is funneling down, that presidents and leaders are taking hold to control policies and direction. I mean, they're actually publishing, we need to reset. And then, I mean, and so this new book you held up, I mean, The Great Narrative, I mean, what is this? This blows my mind. You said it just came out in January. Is that correct?
Yeah, it just came out. And what they're talking about is they want to get everybody on the same page, and they understand the power of stories to influence the mind. And they're taking, in this book, they take 50 people, 50 world leaders and influencers, and they're giving you a snapshot, their worldview. And I'll give you an illustration. You take this Rubik's Cube, and each of those 50 people represents one of these blocks on the cube. But the whole narrative is represented by the face.
Yeah.
And all 50 of them will basically argue for a humanistic worldview. And then they propagate it, with propaganda. And this is the only worldview allowed. Okay. So I'm coming in And I'm saying, no, wait a minute. What about that? What about this world? And we need to start talking about the biblical worldview, but you know what they do with that. You're being censored, canceled, deplatformed, whatever. They don't have room for that. And so as Christians, we really need to dig into the Bible and find out what God says about what's coming next. We look at the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And I think about the first one, when the seal is broken, and you've got the white horse that goes out and conquers with peace.
Yeah.
Now you can jump in here and give me your take on this too, and we'll just compare notes here.
Yeah.
But when I look at that, I'm seeing, well, that could be a covenant of peace to conquer the world with. And in this book, they're talking about social contracts. And what if there's a social contract for peace? And that's exactly what he's saying, that we're going to bring peace. And the only way to do it is have everybody to buy into this new story or this new narrative, which is exactly the antithesis of what Christ came to do. And Christ is the Prince of Peace. So you're rejecting the Prince of Peace to bring peace. It just doesn't make sense. And then you look at the second horseman, and that's the one that brings war, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so here we are. They've already kicked off the Covenant of Peace. That's the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which is a covenant for peace and prosperity for everyone on the planet. Now we've got a war. So this covenant of peace that they're generating means that you're going to have to change the hegemonic structure of the world, that you can't have nations, individual nations, silos doing what they've been doing. You're rebuilding Babel is what you're doing. And you've got that, in my mind, you've got the feet of iron and clay, Daniel's vision, the weak kingdoms united with the stronger kingdoms. And that creates another hegemon. And then you've got, but in order to dethrone the hegemon, what are you going to have to do? Or change the hegemonic structure? There's going to have to be a fall in Western civilization. And I know in February of 2020, the Munich Security Conference met, and the theme of that conference was restlessness. And in that conference, they were talking about a new world order without American and Western hegemony. Now, that was before the first riots, the first lockdowns, well before the election. And then you look at the results of the election and what's happening as America falls. And then I guess the next horse is what we're worried about. And I'm not saying we're following that pattern exactly. I'm saying that as Christians, we need to examine this pattern and see what could come next. Maybe we're just foreshadowing the big day of the Lord.
Right.
But we are certainly following these steps to a degree. And the next one is going to be the black horse of death. Was it plagues or diseases?
One of them.
So
somewhere in the mix.
Confuse my mind. But but what concerns me there, Jake, is you think about Crimea and what Russia did to Crimea back in the 20s and 30s, and they controlled the food supply. And when they controlled the food supply, a lot of people got sick. But it was when they had a drought and they had crop failure. On top of that, more people died of sicknesses and diseases than died of starvation. And that scares me, because the same people creating this new narrative are wanting to control our food supply. And we need to be very diligent. We don't want a repeat of the Crimea event, because when they talk about shaping the narrative in order to save the world, they could put pressure on us by controlling the supply chains.
Well, we're seeing it. I mean, we may not see that unfolding, but we're seeing the impact of supply chain. I mean, just with the trucker convoy, and not just that, but just everything during COVID. So long before, of course, it was in the midst of really the height of COVID and talking about the Great Reset. has a great reset unfolded completely? I mean, is it there? I mean, where's that at?
No, we're still several years away. I know that they're talking about ramping it up throughout 2022, or accelerating is the term that they use. They're not waiting around. They want to have it now. So what they're talking about is controlling the supply chains are a big one. There's another one, another narrative they're throwing out there, and it's about rebuilding trust and establishing trust, because they know that people don't trust the media, they don't trust businesses, they don't trust their governments. So what are they going to do? And they're basically going to force you through indoctrination to start buying into this narrative that you're a selfish person and you need to think more altruistically. And they understand that, you know, people are stressed out, they're fearful, and the anxiety levels have been constant for 2 years now. Well, that destroys trust. So what they're going to try to do is reestablish that. One way that they're going to do it is issue digital identities for everybody, because digitization increases transparency. You can see what everybody's doing. And this should scare everyone out there, because when they digitize your entire identity and they put it on the blockchain, then everything that you do is going to be monitored. When we move into the Internet of Things era, this is all part of the fourth industrial revolution, but in the Internet of Things era, when all of your devices are connected and your IP address is tied to your digital identity, they can see everything you do, but they can also see everywhere you go and who you interact with and what your production and consumption habits are, and the people that you're like. Now, are you buying from companies that practice sustainability? If you do, then you get a pretty good social credit score. But if you're buying from companies that themselves have poor social credit scores, then your social credit score is going to go down. And which opens up another thing. I guess we didn't even really get introduced to that quite yet, but the idea of social credit scores is coming, and it's coming quickly. And I would say that's within a couple of years, easily.
And this is something that's already done in China, right? I mean, is that correct?
China's already doing it. Yeah, China's already doing it. You can go online now and you can look under MetaVisa is a company that's building this, or one of these. Cardano is another company. They're big in Africa and other parts of the world, but Cardano is also going to issue digital identities. It's going to be pretty much to the point where if you want to interact with the metaverse that's coming, or, you know, the new decentralized financing that's coming, or anything, you're going to have to be online.
Yeah.
And when you're online, you're going to have a digital identity. And so they're really going to be watching everything you do, literally. And who does that? That's the accuser. And with artificial intelligence watching everything you do, I'm telling you, Christians need to be very, very diligent. The accuser, the enemy, is going to be a big part of that.
It's such a wild world. And again, what I really appreciate about you, I mean, you're bringing the primary documents. I mean, where this is coming from. It's just hard for me to wrap my mind around that. It seems like, and I think we're seeing it with the conflict in, I don't know, the invasion in the Ukraine, just what a role that global companies are playing. I mean, you've got Elon Musk, shooting satellites over the satellites, dropping internet. You've got companies getting on board. And it just seems like, as you're talking about these social credits, I mean, it seems like it's going to be private sector type companies. It seems like that's taking more of a role and in a sense, globalizing things, faster than we would just the political aspect of it. Is that some of what's going on?
Yeah, they talk about the velocity of change.
Yeah.
And, we've seen so much rapid change that our heads are spinning.
Yeah.
And they're talking about it's going to get so much faster as more companies get on board and more people get trained and realize what they're doing, it's just only going to speed up. I mean, you're talking about, this is $1 billion industry, $1 billion plus, and most people don't even know about it yet.
Yeah, I can't wrap my mind around this metaverse thing that's that's moving forward as well. I mean, it's mind blowing. I'm old enough just to I had made it throughout my childhood and high school without a cell phone, and get on the internet like my junior or senior year of high school. So I'm a little bit on that edge of that, and I know throw my dates out there probably is good either way, but so. A couple things that you bring up, and I know you don't have the answer to that. No one really does. But so we talk about climate change and those things. I know some of it can't be true at all, but is it possible that some of it's true and they're choosing the wrong conclusion? And biblically, we should be expecting, as we approach the latter days, for the world to, in a sense, have an expiration as it is. I mean, as believers, should that be part of our worldview?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up. I talked to an 84-year-old farmer the other day, and I said, look, you've been doing this for a long time. I mean, you've been doing it all my life. And he was out, preparing his garden. I said, but can you answer a question for me? I said, have you changed your planting dates over the last 84 years or however long you've been doing this? And he laughed and he said, well, it might vary a week or two, but no, they haven't changed. And the truth of the matter is, if we're experiencing the climate change that they're talking about and the world is heating up, then that would mean the frost dates are changing.
Yes.
And getting sooner. Yeah. And we're still, where I live, we're still waiting from April 1st to April 15th for that last frost before they go out and plant most of their crops.
Yeah.
And it's not changing. Then you got the USDA plant hardiness zone maps that tells you which plants you can grow in which parts of the country. And those aren't changing. I still live in zone 7B, and that hasn't changed. So if the climate is changing as they say it is, we should expect change. Now, we also need to think about it in another respect. The Bible is very clear the climate will change, but we need to think about the reason why. And it's not because of our production and consumption. Genesis 1:28 says, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth up and use it.
Right.
And a lot of people using it. Instead, and I can't remember exactly where it is. I want to say it's in the Psalms, but I might be wrong. But God says, because we have abandoned his statutes and ordinances, the earth will toss to and fro like a hut in the wind and stagger about like a drunken man. And if the earth is doing that, the climate will change. And then we look back. Is there any evidence in history of climate change?
Yeah.
And I talk about walking on a fossilized coral reef in the Ohio River and looking over my left shoulder facing the river, and I'm looking at downtown Louisville, Kentucky. Now, why is there a coral reef in the Ohio River across from Louisville, Kentucky?
Yeah.
It's out of place. Somehow, somewhere along the way, the climate has changed. And that was, I take that back, and I might be wrong, but we have to look at it abductively and consider the possibility that in the days of Peleg, the son of Eber, when the earth was divided, and that's in Genesis. Okay, the next genealogy over talks about their lifespans and how they were cut in half. So basically, 500 years and older in the older generation, and 250 years or less in the younger generation. Something cataclysmic happened in that one generation.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, could it have been that was after Noah's flood, well after Noah's flood, after the ziggurats were built, and the ideas, had been propagated in people's minds. Imagine after the Tower of Babel falls, or the languages are confused, people spread out across this giant continent of Pangea, perhaps. And then later on, the earth is split and people are spread around the globe.
Yeah.
It's just a possibility I don't think we can ignore. I think we need to
Right.
look into it.
Well, the evidence is there. I mean, in scripture, like you said, there, we're not getting that fully told, but this evidence is there. If we're going to take all the evidence, which really brings me to something else, is you're talking about the restlessness and
Mhm.
moving towards these social credits and kind of this one world system, which is basic atheism, humanism, but that's the Western world. The Eastern world are, for the most part, very religious. I mean, and so how does that collide? I mean, how does the Muslim world connect into this? I mean, and the different places like that, because it seems like that would be colliding as well.
I wouldn't think that you'd have very strict adherence to their faith holding on to that, because it violates the primary assumption of reality. And what I mean by that is, at our very core, when we dig down into our beliefs, you're going to come across um, 5 sources of authority that you make your decisions on, right? You got
Yeah.
reason, tradition, history, experience, and your religion or your divine revelation. And if you're a Muslim, how do you reconcile this? Well, you got tradition, or you've got, I'm going to listen to somebody else, or maybe it seems reasonable that we would run out of resources. Maybe we're just angry at somebody else. But you take it a step further and go a little bit deeper. And behind all of that, you've got 3 assumptions of reality to choose from. Now, as Christians, we believe that God created the world. But if you're an atheist, you're going to believe that nature is all that there is. And this is where they're coming from with this worldview. Nature is all that there is, lean root from nature. And then there's a third possibility, and that's everything, your reality is either in your head or you're just part of some spiritual cosmic reality.
Right. An
And
already existing metaverse.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you're going to find that there's some conflict of beliefs if you were to press into it and you were to question somebody. If you were to question a Muslim, why do you believe this, this, and this? I think eventually you get to a point where it's, you know what, this doesn't add up.
Yeah.
And for Christians, the same way. I have a lot of Christian students in my classes, and they will tell you that we're overpopulated and we've got to save the planet by having less children. And I'm thinking, well, okay, what about Genesis 1:28? Do you believe the Bible? Yeah, I believe the Bible. Well, what does Genesis 1:28 say? And they draw a blank. I think we need to really dig down deep and know exactly why we believe what we believe, and really, really take seriously the idea of, we really need to know who God is and think rightly about God.
That's David, mark that clip right there, because I mean that's what it all boils down to. And we were talking beforehand, so I think you teach ethics, which which to me is amazing, because it is really taking the biblical foundation and then applying it to the stuff we're seeing in the world and the things we battle with. But I mean, I guess you would probably argue just what you just said, that the foundation of that is getting into the word and knowing what it says.
Yeah, and no wonder Jesus taught more about the kingdom of God versus the kingdom of this world than anything else while he was here for 3 years. And
yeah. Well, what should we be looking for in the future? I mean, in the coming future, maybe the near future, with these things that's coming. You probably mentioned them, but kind of streamline it for us. Just as we're looking ahead, what should we expect to face as challenges?
all right, you need to be looking out for what they're teaching your children. Children are one of the top priorities. Sustainable Development Goal number 4, it deals with education, and education is essential for reaching their goals long term. So they're really trying to brainwash you and control the narrative. I like to talk about Plato's cave, and in book 7 of his Republic, he says, imagine you are sitting in a cave, and maybe you're looking around your office. You don't have straight walls in your office, or I mean in a cave, sorry. In a cave, you're going to have contoured walls. Now imagine you're in pitch dark, somebody lights a fire behind you, but you're chained so that you can only look forward. You can't look to the sides or behind you. And between the fire behind you and you, there is a walkway, and objects, real objects, pass by. But all you see in front of you are the shadows dancing across the contoured walls of the cave. And that to you is your reality. And that's the narrative that we see. So we're blinded by our biases, right? You know, that's how people see things different ways.
Yeah.
These are just our own shadows. But if you could break away from the cave and get outside and become enlightened, says Plato, then you can see things as they really are. And you'd want to go back and you'd want to help everybody else. But they're going to be so blinded that when you try to tell them truth, they won't even have the conceptual framework to accept it. And I think that's kind of the place that these globalists are coming from, is they think that we don't have, as Christians, we're so biased in our belief in God that we can't comprehend that the world is going to fall apart. So they're going to have to take over the narrative and force us, in spite of our objections, to do what they think is right and to save the world. So they're coming after our children. And here's what I would love to see Christians do, is take the model that they're using, because they are very effective. They're taking youth and they're training them. And they are instilling in them the confidence to become world shapers. Now, why aren't we doing the same thing with the church?
Yes. Yes. I mean, absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, it's funny. I mean, we deal with the end of the age, is what we deal with a lot here. And it's funny, we don't tell kids that story. I mean, that's why I wrote Jesus and His White Horse, is because we don't tell kids the ending, but then we've got they're every year, at least at Earth Day, if not other times throughout the school year, they're being told, that the globe's, the Earth's going to end if we don't do something. They're telling the narrative, but we're not telling our kids the narrative. And I think it's very important to do so. Doug, this has been absolutely incredible. Before you leave again, how can somebody connect with you and follow what you're doing?
So they can connect with me on Facebook under Doug Carter Writer, and I'm updating my website, so that's going to be a little while. But Instagram, Twitter, and I'm actually on the new Truth Social, so under Doug Carter Writer.
Very cool, Doug. I mean, you've really given some instruction already. Any last thing you want to just share with the audience before we have to go?
Yeah, it's very critical that we do exactly what God said. Bind these words upon our houses, talk about them when we walk down the roads, impress them upon our children, because if we don't do this every day, the world is telling them otherwise. The world is telling them the opposite. And this is a battle for the minds of our children and for the soul of not only our nation, but for the soul of the world. It's literally the kingdom of God versus the kingdom of the world.
And no neutral. Doug, if you can't stick around, because we want to say hello to you as we get off the air, but I just want to thank everybody for tuning in to Talking Stand Firm. And right now, it just seems like there is a lot of folks who are looking for answers as they're watching what's going on in the Ukraine. And to me, I think it's one of those things where it's like you didn't think these things could happen. It's like we're past that in the world. We're a sophisticated world, and we can't see it, even though they've been happening, with what the conflicts in the Middle East, and you don't have to go back far to see Russia in plenty of conflicts themselves. But some reason, this has captured us more than others, and so people are leaning in. If you have found Stand Firm to be valuable, please share, like us on Facebook, subscribe, go to my page, Stand Firm Jake on Facebook, like it, share. We're putting content. And every bit of content that we put out there is in the mind that if you could share, that it could begin to get your friends and family thinking towards some of these things so that they would be ready, that they could prepare spiritually. And I think this is the time that we really need to make available what we're finding in the Word. Again, thank you for being a part of Stand Firm. We'll be back at it next week. And so be sure to be looking for our blog post over at stanfordministries.com. Also be looking for our videos here, wherever you're viewing that. And we'll see you next week. There we go. Stand
2
firm.
takes at one place.
It's like
I wanted to get that in. I'm
one
like,
of those Japanese movies. Everyone, I just want to tell you, everyone, Doug is my go-to guy when things are happening in the world, and he does his homework. And if you can tell, he is humble, he is learned, and if you want to get a hold of him, I'm sure he'd love to hear from you. Like he said, Doug Carter Writer. You could probably email him at dougcarterwriter@gmail.com. Facebook, Instagram. He is a guy who will answer your questions, and he's done the homework.
yeah.
Jake, I know we've gone way over, but it was worth
I want to share one more thing. We've gone 20 minutes over. Why not more, right?
Yeah, let's do a 2-hour show.
When we finish this interview, I think, David, I think you're the one that told me this, or maybe it was in our conversation when we recorded this from both of you. It's almost like this image of an octopus sitting on the earth. That's you, David, right? And
Yeah,
it's got
David.
its legs and tentacles all over the place. And the reason I say that is because we started the program talking about what's going on in Russia and saying, no, that isn't the Antichrist empire. That's still to come. China came up in the conversation. And if you look at the initiative China has, we mentioned China and Taiwan, you look at as Doug talked about, again, this isn't conspiracy. He had the documents. I mean, the
in
World
black
Economic
and white,
Forum,
it's right there.
Yeah, all these global think tanks, what they're doing, all these things, and it's like, okay, well, which one's the end? Well, the thing is, why we see the end in all of them it's because it's the same puppet master running the show behind the scenes.
And
Satan
Glenn Beck wrote a book. Glenn Beck wrote a book called The Great Reset. And he talks about the exact same things that Doug talks about. So, I mean, it's not a conspiracy. It's what's going on. It's not a conspiracy theory. It is a conspiracy.
No, yeah.
Again.
And what I've had to wrestle with is because I think we have the ultimate end within Scripture. But we can look at these other things and we're like, well, maybe we're not seeing, maybe that isn't even really happening because we got this in. No, we've got, it's as if, I mean, if you were going to try to catch somebody, aren't you going to set multiple traps? Right? I mean, if you've got you're trying to catch a mouse, you're probably going to set more than one trap. Or if you don't catch him in the first one, you're going to eventually set more. Satan's had 6,000 years of human history to lay traps in this world. And so, yeah, there's tentacles everywhere, but they all come back to one motive. And that is ultimately against God and to keep us. Revelation 12 says it all. The dragon pursues the woman. Israel pursues her child, which is Christ, pursues his offspring, which is us as Gentile believers, you believers across the world. He's pursuing us. And there's traps set. Sherilyn, I mean,
he knows the bait. He knows what bait to use. So stand firm and be in the Word of God and pray and ask God, because these are signs of the times. The Bible says what's going to happen. It doesn't give you the exact details of how it's going to be brought about from a worldly point of view. And I think that's where people like Doug and even, Glenn Beck's book and things like that will give you part of the how.
Absolutely. Sherilyn, thank you. Again,
thank
you everybody for
praying for you and your
going
family,
and
Jake.
extra time. See you next week.
Thank you guys.